Okay, I'm fine with next person.
Yeah, there are a couple of people I'm going to be checking with because I can't find them.
We're waiting for folks to trickle in. You want to introduce yourself in the chat with your names, your pronouns, your institution, and one thing that made you happy this week? That'd be great. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're so excited to see you. Um, my name is Maya. I am the Texas State Coordinator at Campus Vote Project, and I use she, her pronouns, and I've been one of the organizers of this summit. And Cassie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Cassie Febio. I also work at Campus Vote Project as the Curriculum and Research Coordinator, and I am also a PhD student at UT Austin. And for the last 5 years, I was the coordinator for Texas Votes and actually coordinated the summit in 2018 as well. I will be in the background this entire time, so I'll be the one helping let people in, as well as answering any questions you might have in the chat, and we're making the breakout rooms work appropriately.
Great, thank you, Cassie. So yeah, we want to hear from you. Some of you have already done this, but in the chat, if you could put your name, your pronouns, your institution, and one thing that made you happy this week. So if you haven't done that already, go ahead and pop that in the chat. And while you're doing that, welcome. We're so excited to have you here today. Some of you might have originally come to what was supposed to be, or had signed up for what was supposed to be our in-person summit back in April, that we then did a virtual summit back in April. But you know, part of the pros of this virtual world is that we're able to have so many more people attend this virtual summit because we don't have space constraints. So we're so excited to see so many new faces today. A few housekeeping things before we get started. One, we're recording this, so just for your information, we're recording it so that some folks who can't attend today are still able to get the information. If you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute just so that we can eliminate background noise. If you have any issues or need any help, feel free to put them in the chat or message Cassie privately in the chat. She'll be able to help you. And also we have closed captioning, live closed captioning. So if you need that, you can turn it on at the bottom. There should be a little box that says CC where you can turn that on. And then lastly, ahead of this summit, when we sent you the Zoom information, we sent you a folder, a Google Drive folder with some resources. We'll be updating those resources throughout the next few days and honestly the next week or so. So keep checking back for more resources. But the biggest thing I wanted to mention was we made a speaker booklet, but we're still waiting on some bios, some photos, etc. So that might be edited and updated throughout the next few days. All right, so hopefully you've had a chance to introduce yourself in the chat. I want to go through some community guidelines for today and tomorrow. If you're sharing a story, please use I statements and speak for yourself. Participate actively, so even if you're listening, still be thinking and paying attention. Critique ideas and not people. It's healthy and totally okay to disagree with opinions, but not the person. And then also, make space and take space. So if you've been talking a lot or participating a lot, maybe make some more space for someone who maybe hasn't been saying much or participating as much. Does anyone else want to add any other community guidelines? All right, great. So an overview of the day. Today we're going to have some welcome and introductions, which is what we're doing right now. You'll hear a short message from the Texas Secretary of State, who made a short little video for the summit today. You'll learn a little bit about Texas election law and landscape. We'll have a few different spotlight chats from folks at campuses or organizations who are doing really great work. We'll give you a short break, and we'll also have an equity and inclusion workshop, and we'll close out for today and provide some more reminders and an overview of tomorrow. All right. So also really quickly, so that we can start kind of preparing the breakout rooms. I know a lot of you have already done this, but if you haven't, if you could rename yourself to like the number of your preferred breakout session, your name, and your university, that would be really helpful. So these are the 3 breakout room options. And if you don't know how to rename yourself, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a little like participants icon. Click on that, and then you'll see like a box like this pop up where you can click more, and then you can select rename and then rename yourself. So if you could really quickly do that for us, the number of the breakout session you would like to be a part of, your name, and then your campus or organization. And you can also include your pronouns if you want to. And if you're having any trouble doing this, let us know in the chat box which breakout session you want to be a part of, and we can help you reassign yourself. I still see quite a few people who need to do this still. I'll give you 1 more minute. Okay, we'll move on, but if you haven't renamed yourself to one of these 3 breakout sessions, you can see what the breakout sessions are on the agenda that we sent out in the resources folder that was emailed out to you with the Zoom information. And someone's asking, will you share the 3 breakout options, as in, like, do you want to see like a video of the other 2 if you only attend 1? Is that what you're asking? The 3 options are also on the screen that I'm sharing on the left-hand side. So 1 is media literacy, 2 is creating a nonpartisan student organization, and 3 is, so you're new to this space, a breakdown of resources and organizations. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on, but if you have any issues, feel free to message in the chat, and you can keep doing that. We have a little bit of time before we get to the breakout session. Okay. So we're gonna do a quick little icebreaker. So I'm gonna release like a poll, and the first question has to do with the GIFs on the screen. So which GIF or GIF represents you today? Are y'all able to see the poll? Is that working for you?
Yes, we're able to see everything.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. It looks like everyone feels like they're on fire, but everything's fine. I feel that. That's how I feel. And it looks like, you know, a lot of you have done a little bit of this work, but still feel relatively new to the work. So that's exciting. Hopefully you'll be able to walk out of today with, you know, some tools and resources and a little bit of a better understanding of how you can get engaged and do this work on your campus. And it looks like that's what a lot of you are excited for today. So that's really exciting. Okay, so a few other reminders that I want to give y'all before we start today is, hold on, sorry. Is at the end of the day, we'll be talking about a funding opportunity and mostly talking about it tomorrow. So any of the folks who attend today, your campus has unlocked some really exciting funding opportunities to help you carry out this work on your campus. We'll talk about it a little bit later on in the day, but I just wanted to mention it. So if you stick around today and stick around tomorrow, you'll be able to actually potentially get some money that will help you implement all of the ideas that you hear about today. All right, so next we're gonna hear a quick message from the Secretary of State.
Hi, this is Texas Secretary of State Ruth Hughes, and I want to take a moment to share a message on the importance of registering to vote and staying civically engaged. Throughout the course of the Lone Star State's history, the direction of our state has been shaped by the actions of Texans just like you. There's no better time than now to register to vote and encourage others to do the same. By exercising your right to vote, you can add your voice in shaping Texas's future in matters that impact you, your friends, your family, and your community. Studies have shown that the earlier in life an individual begins to vote, the more likely they are to be lifelong voters. So don't wait, your vote counts. You can start by visiting votetexas.gov and find out how to register, where to vote, and more. Thank you for your involvement and for doing your part to help shape Texas's future.
Awesome. So now I would like to introduce Emma Hilbert, who is a staff attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project and will be teaching us a little bit about Texas election law and the landscape of voting rights in the state. At Texas Civil Rights Project, Emma works in both the racial and economic justice and voting rights programs, where much of her work focuses on the interaction between immigration, voting, and the criminal legal system. Emma came to TCRP with a commitment to fighting for social justice, and since then has enjoyed learning about and leaning into the movement lawyering model. And prior to joining TCRP, she attended the University of Richmond School of Law and also worked at the Legal Aid Justice Center in Richmond, Virginia. So welcome, Emma.
Thanks so much, Maya. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. Slightly different location within the work from home situation, so just wanted to make sure the audio is still good. I'm also juggling two screens, so forgive me if I'm a little bit off center here. So two topics, as Maya said, that I'd like to talk about. One, and maybe most relevantly for students and folks working on colleges, is just an overview of voter registration laws in Texas. And then the second main bucket of things I'd like to talk about is just kind of like an overview of the voting rights landscape in Texas, and a little bit towards the work that TCRP in particular has done. I've also structured this in a way where if we don't get through everything, that's okay, because I put the most important stuff up front. Could I have the next slide, please? Wonderful. Okay, so just as a quick overview, kind of like I said, we'll start with talking about what it means or what it takes to register to vote in Texas in general. And then we'll move into specifically for students what to know if you are interested in either helping students get registered to vote, and then also if you are just yourself a student looking to register to vote, some of the particular things you should know if you're a student with those applications. And then the third piece will be, again, just an overview of the landscape in Texas. Next slide. Perfect. Okay, so registering to vote in Texas. The bad news is that we do not have online voter registration. So just keep that in mind. Some of the stuff I will talk about will involve maybe filling out a form online, but just keep in mind you cannot complete the entire voter registration process online. Maybe in the future, but not today. Until then, so Texas is a paper-based system. So any form that you fill out, again, will be ultimately paper, even if you originally typed in information. In the paper-based system, there are two main ways that you can register to vote. One is through what's called a volunteer deputy registrar. I'll get into a little bit more about what that is, but that's basically a place where that volunteer deputy registrar or a VDR will help you actually fill out the form, and they will take care of it. The second way you can also register to vote is just on your own by basically picking up a form or printing a form and mailing it yourself. Deadlines here, because I'd be irresponsible if I did not put them in here. It's October 5th of this year to register to vote for the November 3rd election. Also, is something that many of you have probably thought about or had to think about recently, unfortunately. It's just, I would encourage folks, if you're not thinking about it already, to register as early as possible. You know, it's unprecedented, I think, at least in our lifetimes, that we've had problems with the Postal Service, but just keep in mind, earlier the better, especially when you have to do mailing for these forms. And I also say for the October 5th, if you are last minute, I know it happens, just make sure that you are, that your application is either in the office for the voter registrar or it's postmarked by that date. If you do happen to find yourself doing it last minute. Next slide. Okay, so let's say you're interested in helping students register to vote in Texas. There are two main ways you can do this, as I said. The first is that you can register students directly, and that's by becoming a VDR, volunteer deputy registrar. Keep in mind, not to scare you, but just to warn you, the only way you can register to vote people in Texas is if you are a VDR. If you are not, there are actually some criminal penalties attached to not being a VDR. So it's basically, if you're handling anyone else's voter registration application, make sure you are a VDR. Anyone can become a VDR, or most people can become a VDR. You just have to be 18 years of age or older, and then also be a resident of Texas. You don't necessarily have to be a resident in the county in which you are. So if you're from Houston, but you're in college in Austin, that's fine. As long as you're generally a resident of Texas, that's fine. And the way that VDRs generally work is that they will pick up forms from the county, specifically the voter registrar, which I'll get back to in a minute. I'm seeing questions, which is great. What I'll do is I'll pause after the kind of like the registration section, and then take some questions about registering. So thank you. So what you'll do generally as a VDR is you'll pick up forms from the county. You'll bring them to whoever you're trying to register. They will fill out the form. You can help them out if they need it. For example, if they have a disability or they otherwise just need help with it. And then you'll review the form and then actually take that form back and physically bring it back to the county voter registrar office. And then you also, as a VDR, it also comes with this like funny little receipt, which is important, that will basically give to the person that you registered. You'll keep a copy, and then you also tell the person that to look out in the mail for their voter registration card, and that their registration will become effective within 30 days out from the day that they're registered. A couple of things to remember with VDRs, kind of quirky things. One is that you can register students only in a county in which you're actually certified as a VDR. So if you're in Travis, for example, and you're certified there, you can only register people who are in, who want to be registered in Travis County. There are some counties who have reciprocity rules. So like they might have a deal with another county or two where they'll accept forms from either county, but just make sure you check and you know those rules. And then the other piece is that these certifications for VDRs come in 2-year terms that expire at the end of an even numbered year. So basically, if you signed up now, your term would just last to the end of 2020, which is fine for this election because all of the registration happens before then, and then you'll have the opportunity to renew your registration, and it's good for 2 years. So it's just 2-year cycles. So to become a VDR, if you are interested in doing this, you should just contact your county voter registrar. As someone who also was new to Texas and also voting rights when I started with TCRP, one thing to remember is that the voter registrar can have a couple different names depending on what county you're in. So for example, in Travis County, they're actually housed with the tax assessor collector. That office might also be called, it might be with the county clerk or the elections administrator. If you get anywhere within the kind of like the voting office, like the voting office of your, or any voting office of your county, they'll be able to direct you. But just keep in mind that you're looking for the voter registrar. And then to actually become a VDR, it depends on the county again, but you'll definitely go through some sort of training. And then some counties will have you also do a test. In Travis, for example, it's just a training. It was pretty quick and painless and fun. I should say that. I should put a plug for it. And then you go from there. And they'll give you all the information about like where to pick up forms, how to turn them in, and all those details. Can I have the next slide? Great. So let's say you are, you either you're not eligible to be a VDR or you just don't want to go that route, both fine. Some other ways you can help students register to vote on campus are by basically helping them register themselves to vote, right? So you're not actually giving them the form, having them fill it out, and you taking it back. You're actually empowering them to do that process. It's more mailing based, but empowering them to do that process themselves. So one thing you can do, for example, is provide the actual physical forms to students. You can pick up blank forms from the county and have students, for example, at a tabling event, like hand fill out the form and then instruct them to, drop it in a mailbox or find envelope and stamp it and put it in the mail. The second way to do that, maybe, which is going to be appealing if you don't think handwriting is the most appealing option for students, is you can actually provide access to an electronic form for students to register to vote. The idea here is that you'll fill out a form. Basically a voter application form, but then you actually have to print it, sign and date it, and then mail it in yourself. That's kind of how that works. So you can find the forms, for example, on a government website. So either the Secretary of State's page or the county voter registrar's page. And those are, again, you can anything you Google will probably get you in the right direction. But for the state level, you can go to votetexas.gov. For county level, for example, for Travis, it's votetravis.com. Travis County also started a fun or an interesting experiment in registration this year, which is you can actually text now. You can text the word register to 48683, and that will actually give you a link to travis.vote. I know this is a lot, but travis.vote, and that's actually just like that will direct you to their application. You can also just type in on your phone or computer travis.vote, and it'll get you to the same place. But I see the appeal with texting is it's convenient. It's another option for you if you're in Travis. The other thing that I will say that with kind of these like electronic, it's not an online application, but it's an electronic version of the application that will turn into paper, is that one, that you can also use these two sites, either a government site or another registration system, to check your registration. So if you're not sure if you're registered, or you're not sure you're registered in the county you want to be in, it's easy enough to check. You generally need some combination of your name, date of birth, driver's license or ID number, those sorts of things, but all information you have. And then the last piece I'll say is that so there's an option to basically fill out the form, get it printed, sign and date it, and mail it yourself. If, for example, you have, maybe you don't have the best access to printing and getting an envelope and a stamp and all those sorts of like mailing things, you can also go, again, to any of these sites. And I think someone pointed out, but like for example, Rock the Vote, Register to Vote, but also the two government sites. And you can basically request, fill out the form, or fill out the voter registration application, and then request that that entity, so let's say Rock the Vote, that they actually they will print it out, send it back to you with a pre-addressed prepaid envelope, and then you can sign and date the form and then mail it back. So again, these are all just different options you have, and it depends on things like if you have access to a printer or not, and that sort of thing. Again, the one piece I will say, is just again, with mailing currently, having the option to have a third party or the county mail you your form and then you mail it back. Just keep in mind that's like 2 ways of mailing instead of one. But again, all good options, especially if you start early. Okay, can I do the next slide? Great. Okay, so a couple of things about registering to vote in Texas. These all apply to anyone registering to vote, not just to students. But I want to point out a couple things that might be particularly relevant for students. One is that you have to be a resident of the county. I know lots of folks didn't necessarily grow up in the same place where they're going to college, and that's totally fine. If, for example, again, if you are from Houston but going to school in Austin and you want to count, Austin or Travis County as your county of residence, that is fine. You just have to make sure to register there. The key here, and it's a little bit sketchy, but the idea here is that you are a resident of the county in which you intend to live, right? And that could mean that you intend to be a resident of your college county while you're in college, and that's totally fine. The one thing to remember here, maybe the easier place to start, is actually to say that you can only be a resident of one county or state. So for example, or even if you're out of state, right? So let's say you're from the East Coast and you're going to school in Texas. Again, you can totally find to be a resident of a county in Texas, but just keep in mind that you should only ever be registered and voting in one county, like within the country. Second, again, for college students, for everyone, but especially for college students in the beginning of the year, you have to be is the age requirement here. So you have to be at least 17 years and 10 months old to register, and then 18 years old or more by election day. So if your birthday is November 3rd or earlier, you should be able to register to vote this year, if you're 17 right now. Couple of other things. And I did not write this on the slide, but keep in mind that you also have to be a U.S. citizen. So, lawful permanent residents, green card holders, DACA students, anyone here on a visa cannot register. So just make sure you check that. A couple other small things that are not hard, but just keep in mind is that you have on the voter registration application, they'll ask for either your Texas driver's license number, or I didn't write it in here, but if you have a Texas ID, just that number is fine, or the last 4 digits of your social security number. And the last piece is that if you are If you have not moved, you're registered where you're supposed to be, that's great. But keep in mind that you should register or update your registration anytime you move, basically. So if you have moved into the county from another county or another state, you'll have to do a new registration form. If you moved within the county, so let's say you moved from a dorm to an apartment, you'll also have to update your registration. It's the same form, but you'll just click, I think it says like change or update instead of new registration. Don't sweat those details too much, but just make sure that if you just keep in mind if you've moved or if you changed your name, which is maybe less common for college students, you'll have to register again. The other thing I'll note, especially for college students, is that on the form, you'll see there's both a place for your physical address as well as your mailing address. So if you are in a dorm, let's say, but you get your mail at a post office box, like a PO box, that's fine. Just make sure you put for the physical address, like your dorm or however you address that, and then your mailing address can be separate, and that's totally fine. All right. So I'm going to pause there for a minute. That's kind of the information I want to share with you about registering, especially on campus. I'll look in the chat quickly. Oh, perfect. Okay, so text to register. Also that. Okay, great. So I think talked about citizenship. All good. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I will move on. But again, we can take questions at the end if folks think of anything. Okay, let's do the next slide. Awesome. All right, so quick overview of some of the news or updates in voting rights in Texas. I'll start with a couple of bills that were passed, or bills that went through the legislature last year, so in 2019, and then talk about a couple cases that TCRP is involved with. Some of these you may have heard of, great, but we'll do a refresher. So one, I'll start with the bad news. House Bill 1888. This was a very short bill, actually, but it did, it was interesting and did damage in a short amount of work. So basically what this did is it requires all early voting locations, so anything before Election Day, to be open for at least 8 hours every weekday, so Monday through Friday during early voting. And what that does basically is it removed the flexibility that counties used to have to plan and operate those polling locations in a more flexible way, right? So for example, a lot of counties would say, okay, we need it's really efficient for us to have an early voting location in this, this church for this neighborhood, but like on the weekends, right? Because the weekdays is not a high traffic time for that neighborhood. And so, or on the flip side, for a college campus to say, look, like it's great for us to have an early voting site on a college campus during the week because that's when we get a lot of student traffic, and it's maybe not very efficient for us to have it there on the weekend. And so the problem though is when you like put this kind of one size fits all blanket on the way that counties are forced to operate their early voting sites, is that it's expensive, right? So they have to make a choice between either keeping those early voting sites that they might not have operated all the time or for the full 8 hours during the week, and keep those open as required. And if they do, so either like they can't have those sites, or they have to maybe eliminate, and this is where some of the real damage comes in, eliminate other sites. So that was a real problem, and again, it had a bad effect, or has had a hard effect on in the sense of voter suppression on folks like college students who might not have, or where the counties just can't afford to have polling sites where they used to, or be as flexible as that. All right, next slide. Passed, so that was bad news. Better news here bill that failed. This was also not a good bill coming out of the legislature last year, but fortunately it was killed. So SB 9, maybe, you know, I don't know if more folks maybe heard of SB 9 than HB 1888. But it was a much longer bill and had a lot of different provisions that basically made it harder, scarier, more partisan, and less private to vote, none of which are good. So one is made it harder, particularly for folks who were either offering or seeking assistance with voting. So for example, if you're elderly and you need assistance with voting, have a disability, maybe you speak another language and you want to, as you're allowed to do, and you want to bring someone with you to the poll to help you maybe read the ballot or otherwise help you make your selections, you're allowed to do that. But SB 9 would have made it basically put a lot of red tape on that. So basically asking people offering assistance to fill out forms, which can be a real deterrent to actually helping folks who need it get vote. It also made voting scarier. And so, for example, it put on both civil and also threatened criminal penalties for voters for things that are really just like mostly innocent mistakes. So things, for example, like filling out your voter registration application incorrectly could have criminal consequences. Things like asking for a provisional ballot when you weren't technically eligible. Again, making a mistake could be penalized in a criminal sense. And also arbitrary things like, I think it was impeding a walkway, sidewalk, or parking lot in a polling place. For example, if you're out there speaking about a candidate or whatever, that was, again, arbitrary, but also would have attached criminal penalties to it. And then also a very strange provision about giving powers to law enforcement. So basically giving them immunity for things instances where they could conduct like a sting operation around trying to like bust potential election violations. So a little bit scary stuff there. And then also the third thing it would have done is made voting more partisan and less private. So for example, allowing poll watchers who are actually part of a political, so either Republican or Democrat, right? Part of a political party, access to go. So if you go up to, for people who are asking for assistance with voting, SB 9 would have allowed poll watchers to actually go into the booth with the person voting and the person assisting them and watch. So that wouldn't have been good. And then it would have also given powers to the Attorney General to certain voter information. And that's not great either, because that contains things like your social security number, your address, all that sensitive information, which they have no need to know. So fortunately, TCRP and a lot of other community groups did a lot of advocacy around SB 9, and the bill did not pass. So that's SB 9, and then I have 2 more cases, or I can save 5 minutes for questions. Let me look in the chat if there's nothing in the chat. Okay, I'll see if I can get through at least one more slide. Can I do the next one? Perfect. So this one actually is a good one to talk about because if we are talking about voter registration, one case that we have known as Stringer 2 is, thanks Maya. Okay, that's fine too. So Stringer 2 is also about voter registration. And if you are frustrated with the fact that there is no online voter registration in Texas, this is a little bit, addresses some of those problems, not all of it, but that's why it's exciting if we can get a win out of it. So in Stringer, there is a law called the National Voter Registration Act, or also known as the Motor Voter Act. In Texas, but it's also a federal law, so it's countrywide or nationwide, that basically requires certain public agencies, so for example, DPS, where you get your driver's license, to treat an application, in this case for a driver's license, the same way that they would treat an application, a voter registration application. The idea here being that when you go to, for example, to get your Texas driver's license, you're putting in all the same information, name, address, citizenship, all those things that you would do for a driver's license, and that can be used and should be used for a voter registration application. The idea being that you submit all that information and you can kind of do two things at once. So that's what the national law allows. In Texas, the way, and this is not for a new application, but for when you first get your driver's license, but if you go online to renew your license every 6 years, or to change your address, if you move and need to change your address on your license, you can go online to do that, and that's fine. But they tried to get around this rule by basically saying that you would go through the whole, like, let's say you're renewing your license, you'd get through the whole process, and then it says, do you want to register to vote? And you could click on it. And instead of that, but despite that process, that did not actually register you to vote. It would basically take you to a new screen where on the very bottom, it would say, okay, if you do want to register to vote, please go to the Secretary of State's page and download and print this form and mail it in. So that was a problem, that is a problem, because nearly 2 million people per year use the system. So we have, understandably, close to 2 million people thinking they're registered and they're not. We actually brought a case, and it was Stringer 1, or just called Stringer at that time, challenging this, basically saying that you can't have this has to be a simultaneous application. It can't be this like crazy process that leaves people out, and sued, again, alleging violations of the Motor Voter Act, but also some equal protection violations. And currently, we have 3 clients or plaintiffs in that group actually were able to get registered. DPS, we found out they are able to actually register people through their online system. And we're now waiting on basically a full decision about whether DPS can now do this for everyone, not just the current plaintiffs in that group. So that's kind of where that case is now. And I'll pause there for real, because I think I'm almost out of time here.
Does anyone have any questions for Emma? You can either unmute yourself or type them in the chat. Okay, well, Emma, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And, as you're doing this work and, maybe having some legal questions or questions about the Texas election law, Campus Vote Project is also part of the Fair Election Center. And we have a team of lawyers that can always, help answer questions that you might come across, or if our lawyers can't answer them, we can reach out to folks like the lawyers at TCRP or some of the other folks that we work with in our coalitions to get you help. So yeah, thank you so much, Emma.
Thank you. Thanks all.
And this is just a slide with more information about Texas Civil Rights Project. Okay, so next up, we have a spotlight chat with some of the students at Texas A&M International University. They actually pre-recorded a short little video, so I'll play that for you now.
Hello everybody, I'm Eduardo Guzman. I was the president of the Political Science Association from Texas A&M International. I was asked to talk a little bit about my time as president and how the Texas Voting Summit helped a lot to develop the projects that we had. At the time I was the vice president, not really the president yet, but I had an idea of making a podcast. And this idea never truly developed well. It kind of was just there in the background. It was kind of like my baby, my passion project. That because we were so busy doing other stuff like voter registration and things like that, it never got into fruition. But everything kind of changed when I attended the summit. They made us do this action plan, which kind of push my idea of the podcast a little bit forward into the more important things that we should do. And thanks to the voting summit, it helped a lot into make a clear idea, a clear vision as to how we could develop this podcast, who do we have to contact, how much effort it's going to take, how much manpower, and things like that. And I'm very grateful to people like Cassie and everyone in charge of the voting summit that, to be honest, without them, we couldn't have done what we did. And in a way, I kind of didn't do it myself, although it was my passion project. And I did recruit my crew and everyone, and I developed the idea and I developed the project as to how it was that it was going to run, how everything was going to happen, the topics that we want to talk about. The podcast was going to be something for students to have a voice of students of TAMU, students that don't really engage in politics, make them engage a little bit in politics. And that's kind of like we wanted to do with this podcast. Talk about not Republicans or Democrats, just the students and faculty and staff of the university, how we all can make the university better, a more voter engaged campus and things like that, civically engaged, but also how we can make the concern of some students be heard, as well as to answer some of the questions they might have regarding civic engagement and politics in the broad spectrum, not only in voting. And I'm very honored that the person that actually got to start a podcast was my dear friend Emily Walker, who became president. Who, fun fact, I asked her to be my vice president and she rejected me right away. So I'm very happy that when I left, she became president, and she was the one that actually took my baby and she did the final kick and she made it happen, which now became Border Talks. And I'm going to let her talk a little bit about it.
The Border Talks podcast is a media platform created by the students for the students, allowing the students to have an outlet to express their political beliefs, their opinions, talk about current topics, world news. With the election coming up, the podcast has been really successful in allowing people to talk about how they feel about it. This includes people of all over the political spectrum. Anybody is invited to come on board. But creating this platform provides a way to reach an audience of greater proportions than maybe hosting an event at school. Media is growing. Technology is only going to keep progressing. And as we continue on, especially during coronavirus, where in-person events aren't so accessible, we were able to create a way to bring this news that other students created to the community, and people can hear what people are talking about and join the conversation where normally perhaps they don't have a comfortable and safe environment to talk about these things. They want to hear what people think. They allow for a space that promotes comfortable, safe political discourse, and that's very important in this day and age. Giving people the opportunity to express themselves and allowing them to provide insight into their own beliefs is extremely important because the media is growing so much. Because technology is growing so much, we might find there's a skewed view in the media and we only see or hear about certain things. But by having this open space, we have been able to increase political awareness in not only our campus, but we've reached out into the community and also out into other cities even. We're promoting knowledge of what is going on, and this is going to be especially important during this upcoming election. So we are very grateful to have such great students and members that are so passionate about participating in this podcast. And it worked out amazingly, and I'm very proud of everybody.
All right. So next we're going to do the breakout session. So we talked about the options before, but a few people have joined since then, and a few folks still need to rename themselves. So there'll be 3 different breakout sessions that you can choose from. The first will be media literacy with Hanlon Tyler, who is a Pointer MediaWise fellow, and they're from the University of North Texas. So that's breakout session 1. And if you want to attend that one, you can rename yourself with number one, your name and your university or your organization. And the way you do that, once again, is click down below with participants. It'll bring up this little box, click more, rename, and then rename yourself. The second section will be about creating a nonpartisan student voting organization with Teddy Landis from Harvard University, as well as Alejandra Cruz from the University of Oklahoma. Both of them have created really successful nonpartisan student voting organizations, and so you'll be able to learn a lot from them. And then the third breakout session is kind of an overview of the student voting space and a breakdown of all of the organizations that are in it, the resources that you can get from these various organizations, and just some space to ask some questions. And I want to thank Dominique McMillan from the All In Democracy Challenge for stepping up to do that. We had a last minute speaker change, but Dominique was really willing to step up and help us out. So thank you, Dominique. So once again, rename yourself so that you can indicate to us what breakout session you want to be a part of. If you don't include a number in your name, we won't be able to put you in a breakout session immediately, so you might miss the first few minutes because we'll be messaging you and trying to reshuffle you. So I'll give everyone like 1 more minute to rename themselves. And also just a quick reminder for Teddy, Alejandra, Hanlon, and Dominique is if you could remember to record your breakout rooms, that'd be great. Thank you. And yes, that answers Shina's question. Yes, the breakout sessions will be recorded and we will be putting them in that resources folder afterwards so that you can view the other sessions that you weren't able to see in real time. Okay, Cassie, I'll turn it over to you to let folks into the breakout rooms. If you do end up having any questions or having any issues with the breakout room, on the bottom right hand of your screen, you should see a red button once you've joined the breakout room that will say like return to main session, and you can always pop back into the main session if you're having issues and someone will be there to answer your questions. But you do have to, press join breakout room, which just popped up on your screen to join.
Okay, everyone, it's 12:40. If you want to start making your way back, that would be awesome.
Okay. So next we have a spotlight chat about coalition building. And I'm going to introduce Anthony Zhang, who is the former president of Texas Votes and a student at UT Austin.
All right. Hello, y'all. So before I was president of Texas Votes, I was our Civic Engagement Alliance chair. So Maya and Cassie kindly invited me today to talk a little bit about how we built a huge coalition of over 100 student organizations to promote civic engagement on our campus. So I don't think I did anything super innovative, but I absolutely did put in all the effort and work needed. I mainly just emailed every single person and student organization available in our HornsLink database, which is our student organization database. I left no stone unturned, and I definitely made a special effort to tailor our emails to specifically the low turnout groups, such as Asian American and Latino students. So I felt like that was something I definitely focused on. And by reaching out to everyone in the everyone in the database, I was able to build a coalition of organizations that wasn't all just political organizations. I feel like that just doesn't really have the greatest optics, does it, if you're trying to make a coalition? So don't ever leave any stone unturned. You don't know, like, just because someone's in a a cappella group, that doesn't mean they don't care about politics. And we had several a cappella groups, a Caribbean Student Association, and a lot of other organizations that you would not necessarily think would be in there. I think something to emphasize was that we didn't have much institutional support. So I wouldn't say our administration is necessarily hostile to our efforts, but they didn't really do anything to make our lives easier, to say the least. So this was completely student driven. Basically no administration on the side of the Office of the Dean of Students or anything like that was involved at all. And just because you don't have institutional support doesn't mean that you can't get anywhere, because we still did really great work. And I think one difficulty that I had that I think a lot of y'all might experience if you are coalition building is trying to get everyone engaged who are not in the political organizations. So that can be a little bit difficult because their work might not directly relate so much to civic engagement, but you need to find a way to frame it as such. So one of the things that we did that was really, really successful that I hope I can see other people put into practice is having fun events that can include everyone on special occasions like last day to register to vote or the first day of early voting or something like that. So on the last day to register to vote, I believe we had a booth where we had 5 or 6 organizations. And if you completed each stage in our sequence of organizations and each person had a specific tidbit about the voter registration process, you could get all our stamps. And then once you got all the stamps, you could get entered into our raffle. So that was a really great way to integrate lots of people. I think my time is almost up. So I actually have to go soon because I have work at 1, but I will leave my contact information in the chat if anyone wants to contact me about coalition building. And I believe Maya and Cassie will also share my contact information. And I'm really, really happy to receive emails. I would love to talk to you about this.
Yeah, we'll be sharing contact information and resources for the speakers who want it to be shared in that resources folder on one of the Google Doc links that says resources. Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for sharing and talking to us about coalition building.
Of course, thanks.
Okay, so next up, hold on, sorry. We are going to be doing a equity and inclusion workshop. But first I want to introduce my colleague Chad, who will be helping us out with this. So Chad is the Florida State Coordinator at Campus Vote Project and received his BA in Mass Communication from Bethune-Cookman University in 2012. He has a passion for organizing and has done a lot of really great work to lead the Legacy Initiative at Campus Vote Project. And Chad will be helping me out with this presentation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Maya, thank you so much for that introduction. I am so happy to be here with Texas Vote Summit. I think you always had some good conversations already. Hopefully this will add to the conversations that you guys are having and any plans that you're coming up with. So I'm going to be talking about equity and inclusion. And before I get to this information, I think the whole point of this workshop and of the things that we are going to be going over is to add to your plan, but also to change your mindset in the way that we think about equity and inclusion. I think a lot of the work around equity and inclusion is mental as well as physical, in the sense of putting things into our plan. So what we'll be doing, just most of these are going to be questions. Most of these are going to be prompts for you to answer in the chat, as well as for you, if it depends on how Maya and Cassie want to do it, to unmute yourselves if you can. But we're just going to be going through the thought process of it all, and what it looks like on your campus, and different ways to think about it. So what is equity and inclusion? We'll start there. Equity is the guarantee of fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all, while striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. Inclusion is authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and or groups into processes, activities, and decision policy making in a way that shares power and ensures equal access to opportunities. And I'd just like to take a moment to pause right there, just to say that just because you have one doesn't necessarily mean you have the other. You can have a bunch of people in a conversation without having that share of voice, an equal share of voice in a conversation. And then you can also be doing things to include different voices, but not have enough different voices at the table, or one voice being predominant in that. I think a great quote to go by when we're talking about equity and inclusion is, inclusion is being asked to the dance. Inclusion is being invited to the dance. Equity is being asked to dance. And so just to think about those things, how we include the people on our campuses, be students, be staff, or anyone else associated with our campuses, and with the work that we do. So I'll go to the next slide. So what does it look like, right? This is something that we've all seen. This is something that has been explained, but I'm going to add a little bit to it. With equity is not giving everybody the same thing, because people have different needs based on the different parts of themselves and based on the different areas where they feel like they are being engaged from the political standpoint. So as you can see, in equality, it's not enough just to give everybody one box. You have to give everybody the resources, the attention, and the input and the opportunities based on where they are coming from. And I think another important part that I try to mention is the presence of the fence. As you can see, all of them are standing behind the fence, which means that each one of them not only have their own place in equity, but each one of them fit into a specific type of gap, just like each one of them are standing in front of a specific plank on that fence. And this is to say that we are all being either neglected or being assumed about in some point of our identity, whether it's our race or our religion, our sexual preference. There are going to be, because we are multifaceted individuals, there are going to be parts that have to be brought to the forefront of our conversations that aren't always obvious. So I just like to have everybody think about that. And then what gaps are you in when you approach these people? What may be some of your blind spots? And how do you bring equity to these conversations and just not equality? So I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. So equity and inclusion is a process. I think it's something that sometimes we feel like, oh, well, we did great in this area this year for our campaign, so now let's tackle another area, or let's leave that area alone. As we know, with the way the world changes, new gaps are being formed every day. New identities are being brought into the light. New ideas, new ways of thinking are emerging as we continue. So the first thing I would say is find those gaps that may be on your campus or in your area. The best way we'll talk about the best way to do these things, but then after you find those gaps, learning more about the gaps. It's not just good enough to know something exists. It's once you understand it, once you know that it exists and you are aware of that, then the next way is to understand why it exists and how it exists, what brought it to be. Then there's acting to address the gaps. It's just another step in what may seem simple, but I think a lot of thought has to be done around this, because there are some obvious answers and there's some not so obvious answers to how we act to address these gaps and to the things that we have the capacity to do and things that we want to do on our campuses. So I'll go to the next slide. So finding the gaps. The first question to ask, and like I said, you can put it in the chat if you would like to. What information do you already have about your campus? What is some information that your campus collects, or that your department collects, or that your club collects, that can illuminate some gaps that you may be encountering on your campus? What are some things that you have at your disposal? For some campuses, there is InSolve. So not every campus is involved in InSolve, but even if you don't have InSolve, you have campus demographics. Campus demographics, every campus has them, right? Every institution is required to understand who was on their campus, in what number, in what quantity, and what that influence looks like. The next question is going to be, what type of gaps are you seeing, right? Are you seeing a gap with race? Are you seeing a gap with different cultures on your campus that may be predominant? Are you seeing an academic gap to where more people are involved from one major than there are in another? Are you seeing where there are just not as many people in this major, so therefore they're not as thought about in conversations around politics and engagement? And the reason why it's important to identify those gaps is just to, when you move on to the next step, you'll see the different type of research you can do. So who currently addresses these gaps is the next question. And that question is being asked so that, one, you're not being redundant in the work that you are doing and that you want to do on your campus. Two, to even give you more information. I think like the gentleman was saying before me in the coalition building, is just you have to see who is doing the work, how you can work with them. Because I think another thing that we do is, just because it's a new idea for our club or our group or our organization, we assume it's a new idea for other clubs, groups, and organizations, and that may not be necessarily true. And so it's an easy ask to find those organizations and those clubs and other groups that already address the gaps you are seeing, so you can come together and to form that coalition and to talk about, some ways that would be beneficial. I'll move on to the next one. Learning more about the gaps. So like I talked about before, why might these gaps exist? So for a cultural, let's take a cultural gap, for instance. Like, what is a way that a cultural gap could come up? One of the ways is like community colleges, to where most of the people enrolled in the school is from a specific area because of that community. But then you also have people that come who still come to community college, but they may have just moved into the state, or they may be in some type of program. They have to spend 2 years at a community college and then go to a major college. So it's just different things as to these things help you approach these people in authentic and in naturally curious ways. And when I say curious, I mean curious in a way where we're not assuming where these people are coming from, but we are interested in the discovery of where they are coming from before we come to them with the information that we have. So personal gaps. What is this person's personal experience with the electoral process or with engagement on the campus? What are their personal leanings that may not be obvious when it comes to other ways that we see them? Then when it comes to educational, which is a gap that is going to be on every campus simply because we bring in new freshmen. Some are 18, some are 17. Some don't have that the education about the electoral process. Some don't have the education about the how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, and all of those things. So looking for why these gaps exist that you found in the first place from the first step definitely helps you build more and definitely helps you with your approach. And then the next question is, how can you better understand these gaps? One of the ways is interviews. The people that you'll see are in the middle of these gaps that you have access to or that you may not have access to. Talk to them about what they want to see. Talk to them about why they vote or don't vote or ambivalent about the voting process, because that gets you to a place where once again, your information can be contextualized according to who that person is and where they're coming from. And then there are other types of research that you can do, like things like this, where we look at other campuses and we say, okay, this worked at that campus, that worked. This is how they address these gaps as a campus. How can we make it make sense for our campus? And other research is sometimes is going to be through watching documentaries. Sometimes it's going to be through reading whole books or sections of books that apply to where your club or where your department is coming from, just to make sure you have base knowledge. And when you come to other people and when you come to the people in those gaps, it can be something that's very, organic and very natural. And I'll move on to the next slide. Acting to address these gaps. And you can move on. You can just do the whole slide. I think this is pretty short. So acting to address these gaps. For every gap that you find, there's going to be a different solution, or there may be overlapping solutions. So are you going to give more access to these people? Are you going to have face-to-face conversations as opposed to just social media with some people when it comes to the education? And then how are you using the information you found? Are you using it as a basis, or as you're using it to inform strategy? Are you saying, because this major is not being talked to, we're going to talk to this major more? Or are you saying we're going to make sure that when we talk to any major, this information can be included in that process and in that presentation? And then the best question is, how are you measuring success? Because simply just because we address a gap doesn't mean that that gap has been closed. And time alone opens gaps more and more. And we've seen that in the last few years and decades, even in this country, where things we thought had already been discussed and handled are now back to the forefront for one reason or another. So how are you measuring your success with these gaps? And how are you going to make sure that you are continually informing yourself through research, through finding those gaps, and through understanding? So I will pause right there. And Maya and Cassie, you all can let me know if you want to take questions or if we just want to move on to the next point.
Yeah, so the next part is going to be largely interactive, but I do want to pause for a few minutes to maybe, if folks have questions, you can either type them in the chat or quickly unmute yourself and ask the question. Okay, so while folks maybe are typing out some questions in the chat, I want to kind of frame the next exercise. So we're going to be doing a very interactive exercise, and we'll be breaking you out into small little breakout rooms. And so I would encourage you, if you don't have your video on, to turn that on if you're able to, because we're going to be having some really small discussions, and I'll just make it feel like you're talking to real people if you have your video on. And before I describe the exercise, let me see. There's a question.
I don't think I see anything.
So yeah, the next exercise that we're going to do, we want to kind of frame this conversation and contextualize it with some stories of students who are being impacted on campuses. And we've created some stories, and while the following stories are fictional and don't depict actual persons or events, the experiences that these students face are grounded in the realities of students on the campuses we work on. You're going to meet a few students at various campuses across Texas. These campuses have worked hard to increase access, have thoughtful voter education, and have created a culture of democratic engagement on their campus. So these experiences are the lived reality of students on your campuses, and we hope that when you are thinking about how to engage your community through the lens of equity and intersectionality, you're also considering how all students are impacted by the strategies you implement, and not simply the stereotypical student on your campus. So we're going to hear more about these students and what their campuses are doing to support their efforts. So we'll share one story, and then we're going to break you up into breakout sessions, and you're going to discuss what gaps are illustrated in the profiles, and then what are also some of the best practices that we can take away from the story. So if you really quickly want to either screenshot this or take out your phone and like take a picture of this slide, these are the questions you're going to be discussing. And you can also like take pictures of the slides that I'm going to show next to like jog your memory about the stories. So I'll pause for a second if you want to take a screenshot or a picture. There also should be people in every one of your breakout sessions who have the questions ahead of time as well. Okay, so the first student is Rosa Diaz. So meet Rosa Diaz. Rosa is a first-year government student at a Hispanic serving institution. She just joined the Political Science Association and quickly found a leadership position serving as the Events Committee Junior Chair. She was excited to take on the challenge of planning National Voter Registration Day. The first thing Rosa did was talk to the leader of her school's Civic Engagement Coalition to see who she thought would join. They recommended she speak to their Student Government Association president about speaking at the event. The school's chapters of JOLT, Move Texas, and Texas Rising to help with voter registration and information at the event, and also reaching out to groups like the university's award-winning Mariachi Ensemble and Spirit Team to bring more people to the event. She was also directed to contact the National Voter Registration Day Campus Takeover Team because they were awarding small grants to universities to support events like Rosa's. Rosa also had to attend an event meeting with student activities who helped her plan the physical logistics of her event. They reminded her to make sure she had all of the tables and chairs she needed, that the event should take place in a space where folks could access the location with wheelchairs, and to have a backup plan for rain. So now fast forward to National Voter Registration Day, and Rosa was proud that her event was a success. They registered over 500 people to vote and shared more than 800 informational flyers. The Student Government Association president live streamed her speech on social media, so more students came out to visit once they saw her video. Not only did JOLT, Move Texas, and Texas Rising come to help with voter registration and education, so did organizations like the Student Engineering Council and the Communications Council. They signed up to participate due to an email Rosa sent to the entire coalition. Not only did the coalition organizations help with voter registration, but they also shared multilingual flyers about why it was important to vote, where and when to vote, as well as what was on the ballot. One of the organizations even worked with the county in order to bring out a voting machine for students to practice voting on, so that when they went to the polls on election day, it was a tiny bit less intimidating. Students and their families came to see the Mariachi Ensemble perform and take pictures with their school mascot. This meant that even more people were registered to vote and learned about the political process. Rosa finished the day exhausted, but was excited to vote in her first election. When she saw how important and successful her event was, she decided that she might want to run for Political Science Association president in the future. So that's Rosa. Cassie is now going to break you out into small little breakout rooms, and you'll discuss what you learned and what are best practices. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So as folks start to trickle back in, I'd like some of you to unmute yourself and tell us, what was one best practice that your group talked about that can be taken away from Rosa's story?
Our group noted the accessibility that they went in setting up the space, making sure that everyone, those using wheelchairs and not, were able to access the space and be comfortable.
Yeah, that's a great point. And especially if your event is going to be outdoors, generally buildings and college campuses have to be ADA accessible, but if especially it's outdoors, thinking about, can someone in a wheelchair with other needs access the space? But also even within the building, sometimes there's older buildings on campus that, it might be an auditorium and the like stage space isn't super accessible. Thinking through that as well. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else want to share one best practice they talked about?
They also talked about bilingual flyers so that even if people don't understand English, they can attend.
Yes.
Yeah, and our group talked about just reaching out to different student organizations so that a lot of different types of people would be in.
Yeah, adding to that, my group also kind of went over it into how Rosa was involving not just like the political component, but also like reaching out to the mariachi so that other students could like feel that sense of belongingness, feel represented and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing.
I want to add really fast that Rosa's a freshman, and I don't know how many of you have been organizing for how long, but a thing that we learned really quickly at UT is the more involved you can get your freshmen, the better, because they have the most energy to put toward these kinds of efforts. And so I liked that there was a leadership opportunity for freshmen, which like not all organizations or institutes have.
Yes. Anyone else want to share something that they thought was a good idea?
I really liked how they didn't automatically rule out like organizations like I think they mentioned like engineering. Because I feel like that's something that like even I've done personally. Like I just kind of think like, oh well, they're not going to be interested, but I think it's important to reach out to as many people as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
We also talked about coalition building and to kind of tack onto the last comment about working with groups that might not necessarily be political groups that might be able to provide other resources in terms of space or organizing or entertainment or just bringing their members out, things like that.
Yes. One of the said rats need volunteer hours, LOL. Reach out to Greek Life on your campus. That's a great way to get a population of students engaged.
Well, also in my group, we talked about reaching out to the non-traditional students and learning from each other, because I'm a non-traditional student and those that are 50 plus have a different perspective on the political policy and involvement. And as the other presenter mentioned about leave no stone unturned, and we have to figure out a way to connect.
Yes, that's a really important point. And I think some of the other stories will also illustrate this is Making sure, yeah, you're reaching out to the non-traditional students and maybe some of the students who might not be as involved in campus life, but still really need to get that important voting information. I think another point I wanted to make sure you took away from the story is make sure you really know your university systems, especially if you're at a larger university where there are some, hoops you have to jump. If you have to meet with student activities before hosting an event, definitely do that, and be aware that that's a thing that you need to do. If you're meeting with them, they can often speak to areas of inclusion, especially for those who need assistive devices and technology that you maybe wouldn't have even thought about before. And yeah, someone mentioned it earlier as well, like bringing the mariachi band on and like really making people feel included in the community is a great thing. And also like invite community members to come onto campus and join. Voting can be a family event and can encourage even more people beyond students to turn out to vote. Also, someone says sometimes reaching out to building proctors around campus helps too. Absolutely. Okay, anyone else want to say any last things about this story before we move on? Okay, so next we're gonna give you 2 stories at once, and then you're gonna break out into breakout sessions, and someone in your group should know which, you're gonna discuss one of the 2 stories. So maybe just, take some notes for yourself on both of the stories, and then you'll discuss one of them in the breakout room that you go to after that. All right, so the next story is about Shuri. She is a second-year mechanical engineer who recently just transferred into Vote University from Wakanda Community College, and she is still trying to figure out her place on campus. She hasn't really gotten involved on campus, but is very active in her church community off campus. She has been really enjoying her classes a lot, and especially her intro to engineering class with Professor Stark. One day, Professor Stark shared with the class that they were going to do a discussion on engineering and how it connects to the political world. He prompts the class to write on sticky notes with the following questions. In the field of engineering, the policies that elected officials develop impact me because, and then a blank. And why is voting important to you, to the campus community, to the state, to the nation? Why is it important globally? When the students finished writing their thoughts, they were tasked with walking around the room and reading everyone else's responses. The professor then asked the class, what resonated with you? A student raised their hand and said, engineers are the ones who are creating the voting machines that read our ballots. If we as engineering students don't think or care about the election or voting, how can we expect our democracy to work? Shuri also raised her hand and said, this is all new to me and I haven't given all of this a lot of thought, but someone wrote how NASA funding is tied to the government. I guess voting is important because I want to have a say on how my life is impacted because of the decisions of others, like my paycheck when I work at NASA. In the last 10 minutes, Professor Stark said, thank you for participating in the discussion and thank you to Steve, a member of the Campus Voting Coalition who came to me with this idea. The work of the Campus Voting Coalition is so important and I hope that you register to vote with them and help them out in the future. After class, Steve thanked Shuri for sharing her thoughts and asked if she would want to volunteer with the coalition. Their next meeting is about figuring out where the best places for buses to pick up students on the way to the polls. Shuri got more info and tentatively agreed to joining their next meeting. All right, so I'm gonna pause for a second, maybe think of some best practices while you have the story fresh in your mind. Okay. The next story is about Rachel Chu. Meet Rachel Chu. She is a third-year economics major who lives at home with her mom. Since her commute is an hour away from home, she doesn't usually participate in campus life that much outside of classes. She occasionally goes to Asian Student Association events since her best friend is Peck, the VP. She came to support Peck today because she is leading the collab that the Asian Student Association was doing with the Center for Civic Engagement called Not at the Dinner Table, Talking Politics with Your Family. At the workshop, they talked about the intersections of the AAPI history, identity, and social justice, and how that impacted how AAPIs approach voting today. Also, the Centers for Civic Engagement and the Asian Students Association team worked together to provide some pointers on casual deliberative dialogue skills on how to engage your parents in conversations. In the small groups, Rachel shared how her dad is not a citizen and her mom was naturalized when she was in elementary school. She also shared that she doesn't think her family votes, but hopes that she can help register her mom when she gets home. At the end of the event, Peck says, "We have an exciting announcement. Working with the university president, they have made a campus-wide policy of not penalizing students who have to miss class to cast a ballot, as long as they notify the professor in advance. However, students are still responsible for any work that they've missed." At the end of the events, the students left with a handout that helps them make a plan to vote, and the materials were handed out in multiple languages. Rachel took a handout for her mom in Mandarin, a language that her mother is more familiar with than English. At home, Rachel and her mom discussed registering to vote, and her mom casually mentioned that she has voted in every election since she became a citizen. Surprised, though happy, Rachel and her mom worked to fill out the handout and scheduled a time to vote together on election day. All right, so maybe think for a minute about some best practices from Rachel's story. Okay, so now you're going to be broken out into small breakout rooms where you're going to discuss one of the two stories, and then we'll come back and discuss both of them. All right, so as folks come back, I want to start by talking about Cherie's story, and if anybody wants to unmute themselves and maybe share something you learned from Cherie's story, I thought was a really good idea.
My group, we talked about how the professors sort of wanted to engage the students in thinking about how voting sort of impacts themselves, and then we really liked how he posted their ideas around the wall and had other people reflect on other people's sort of experience with voting and how it would impact other people besides themselves, and sort of reflecting on how it would also impact their career in engineering, because people wouldn't necessarily make a connection within engineering and voting, but it's very clearly that there's a connection there, and whatever you do in the future, there will be a connection with whoever you elect.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Juan. Yeah, reaching students in the classroom is really big, because not every student engages in campus life, but every student should ideally be going to classes. And especially having plans to go into either intro classes or required classes for certain majors is a really great way to meet students where they are. And also, Steve kind of pulled Cherie away at the end and was excited that she spoke up and used that as a way to make an ask of her to come to the meeting and get more involved in the Campus Voting Coalition. And also for professors out there, the Professor Stark was able to do a classroom activity that was inspired by the Project Pericles voting module. And, using your role as a faculty member to, bridge the gap between students' careers and democratic engagement is really helpful. So yeah, thanks for sharing, Juan. Anyone else want to share ideas that they thought were great?
Towards the end of the discussion we were having in my group, Alexis mentioned how Cherie is a transfer student, and as a transfer student, that didn't even occur to me that we should be reaching out to transfer students more, or not necessarily more, but to keep in mind that transfer students are a certain type of student that isn't necessarily catered to as much, especially in traditional campuses.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Other thoughts or ideas about Cherie's story? In my group, we talked about rides to the polls and that being a really important aspect, especially if there's not an on-campus polling location, or if the on-campus polling location is kind of on the edge of campus and you have a really big campus. You could, either run a golf cart, or if the polling location is a little bit farther away, you could consider getting a bus that kind of drives back and forth between campus and the polling location throughout the day. It can be a little expensive and might be a little difficult to navigate this semester, but it's a good thing to keep in mind for future elections. And also, if that's not possible, many places are served by rideshare companies like Uber or Lyft, that in conjunction with national organizations like Voto Latino or Rock the Vote sometimes offer free or discounted rides to the polls on election day and during early voting. So you can look out for that and see and promote that information if you can't organize a formal ride to the poll system, but want to make sure students have information about how they can get there. Anyone else want to share thoughts about Cherie's story? The last thing I'll say is Professor Stark gave a really enthusiastic introduction to Steve. And so we've seen that when faculty members give a dynamic and engaging introduction to a guest speaker, the students are more willing to listen to that speaker and register to vote. It just weighs a lot more when it comes from their professor's mouth. And also, plan and train your volunteers to register students in the classroom. Students are a captive audience, and we've seen, the strongest percentage of completed voter registrations when campuses integrate class reps into their voter registration plans. And I'm happy to talk more about really successful models of how campuses have been able to do that and reach and go into, really large classrooms, like 500-person large classrooms, and do it really successfully and efficiently. Yeah, okay, so next we'll talk about Rachel Chu's story. So does anyone want to share some ideas that they got from hers?
Yeah, I know in my group, we talked about understanding how different populations define citizenship. And I think they did that really well in this story by going into the history of AAPI and understanding what they feel is true citizenship based on their history, as well as the different avenues to citizenship that even her parents took from one another. So that's something that we talked about in our group.
Awesome, thanks for sharing, Chad.
Well, I was also in a group with Rachel, and we talked about her going to vote with her mother and getting others involved in the voting process, and also having the information distributed in different languages.
Absolutely, thanks for sharing, Howard.
Yeah, I think going along with what's been said, we thought it was really good how they related voting back to family life and community. And she was able to kind of go back home and have her mom join her, get registered together, go make a plan to vote, etc. But one thing that that we also mentioned was like the definition around citizenship and how like people who aren't eligible to vote can still be involved with civic engagement, and thinking through like what sort of opportunities they have to make sure they're still kind of like using their voice and showing that, they're a part of the community and advocating for the issues they care about.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for sharing, Eddie. And Cassie said, given that many students are staying home this upcoming semester, we could definitely encourage our students to vote with their families if they care and are comfortable and safe to do so. And I think that's a great idea. The other thing I'll say, expanding on what Eddie was talking about, is tomorrow we'll hear a spotlight about ways that you can engage non-citizens in civic engagement as well. Anyone else want to share something that they took away from Rachel's story?
So I think that this relates to both the stories that we discussed. In our group, we also talked about how we are here kind of preaching to the choir, right? Like all the people that are attending this, we think that voting is important and that we want to encourage people to be engaged. As a professor, I have experienced that if you push too hard, people are really getting demotivated. And if you start a conversation with voting is important, then you should vote, that people are even sometimes feeling ashamed that they're not included or not voting or not engaged. And so I think the emphasis of the message should be more on informing people instead of pushing people to do something, because that can actually have a reversed effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing. And I think, part of Rachel's story that kind of goes along with that is the Center for Civic Engagement worked with the Asian Students Association to do a talk about, talking about AAPI history and social justice, and giving that information, and then at the end kind of connecting it to voting is a great way to lay out all of the cards to students and give that information, and also put in voting information, but really it be kind of more informational. And then the other aspect of the story that I also wanted to make sure we highlight is the materials that they handed out were having students make a plan to vote. You know, thinking about ways that students can carve out time in their busy schedules to vote is really important, because, you know, oftentimes if you just ask someone, hey, are you going to vote? They'll say yes, but then they haven't really thought about, like, oh, on election day, which is a Tuesday, I have work all day, or I have work in classes all day and I can't actually vote on that day. But maybe I should vote early. If you know, get folks to write down their plan to vote of how and when and where they're going to do that, that's a really helpful tool in helping people turn out and think through that whole process. And, you know, while you're doing that, you know, people might come up with questions of like, oh, I actually don't know where my polling location is, or, oh, I actually don't remember what type of ID I need to go vote. And so that's a great way to also kind of work in some voter education pieces as well, of helping students navigate the whole process. All right, so wrapping up, I think hopefully you got some ideas about, you know, how you can incorporate some of the best practices into your engagement plans, with, you know, thoughtful and intentional voter education, creating a culture of democratic engagement, and removing the barriers to voter access. Chad, do you want to say any last words and wrap this up?
Yeah, I guess the biggest thing is that it's a cyclical process. You know, equity and inclusion it's a hot topic right now, so people are focused on it, but we need to be focused on it in every election. We need to be focused on it in every day, in everything we do on our campuses, because I think that we have to remember that students are on our campuses more than they're thinking about voting. And so even in times between elections, you know, making sure that we are also using these models for equity and inclusion in every event that we throw, in every conversation that we have, so that when it comes time to have these conversations about voting, then it will be second nature to us, and then those people that we are engaging are already be opened up to know that our reason to approach them is genuine, and that we've done the work to reach them, and that we are willing to still listen and do even more work with them on our side as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Chad, and also Eddie and my CVP colleagues who hopped on to help facilitate the breakout discussions. And we definitely can continue this conversation, and I'm happy to, you know, have one-on-ones and talk about, you know, looking over your action plan and incorporating equity and inclusion into it if you haven't really specifically thought about it before. Okay, so we're almost done with the day. We're so close. Before we end and with some closing remarks, I want to share this last spotlight chat for the day about Prairie View A&M. I just want to preface this video that you're about to watch that this was edited from like a 25-minute conversation. We're going to put the whole video in because it's really inspiring and has some really great content in that resources folder, but we've edited it down, wow, words are really not working for me, to about 10 minutes that we'll show here.
But this is a fragile democracy, and it's so fragile, we got to protect it so that future generations can enjoy these freedoms that we have come to enjoy. And they were not obtained easily. People had to march, had to get dogs sicked on them, water hoses, get bitten, hung, burned, all this crazy stuff to fight for this right. And this right is something we should all cherish as American citizens, and it should be easy, not hard for people to participate. Oh yes, I'm Frank Jackson. I'm Director of Community Affairs here at Prairie View A&M University.
But guys, I'm Jayla Allen. I am a recent graduate of Prairie View A&M University and a proud alum. Done a lot of work around the student voting rights on the campus and within the community of Prairie View. where I was able to complete my undergraduate degree in December 2019 when I walked the stage.
And it's about students having the right to choose where they want to vote. In a lot of small towns like Prairie View, students constitute the clear majority. And that majority needs to have its voice heard and recognized as being the force that it is. And oftentimes we get adverse reactions to the students, and it shouldn't be. It should be embracing them, because Prairie View being a land-grant university, it's about teaching the broad pattern of democracy. And you're training future citizens of this great country. So you got to get them ready to take their role in society and perform those roles. And so we think we're on point with what we're doing. We think it's the right thing to do. But Waller County has a history of being adverse to student participation. And students at Prairie View have always pushed back historically. Beginning in the early 70s, students pushed back, and they fought until they were able to get a decision that allowed all students across this country to have the right to choose where they wanted to call their residence. That was the first big issue. We overcame that hurdle. Then we started getting other kind of hurdles about voter fraud. And we found out that that was not true because they had gerrymandered the campus into voting boxes that if you moved across the street, you were in a different voting box. And out of the 4 county commissioner precincts, Prairie View was in 3 of them. You say, wait a minute. So the gerrymandering and all that stuff, we prevailed against that. And thanks to students like Jayla, we've been able to survive and thrive and keep pushing forward with this agenda. And I will pause right there.
There's a lot of work, and there's a long history of voter suppression and voter suppression tactics that have been used against the students in the community of Prairie View. And it has truly been an honor to serve as an advocate for those students and within that community, but also to be an organizer and to bring change to a community and a campus that is often overlooked. And as Mr. Jackson also mentioned, it's a lot of these small towns that are often suppressed when it comes to voting rights, and among other things, especially for those of the Black and Brown community.
Yeah.
So I first started off within my first semester. I ended the semester by being appointed. I was originally running, and I was appointed precinct chair within the 309 precinct, which is basically the university's precinct. It falls at the university's precinct. I served as precinct chair, and I basically ran a campaign off of student civic engagement with other student organizations, my friends and colleagues of PSP, the Student Government Association, the Panther Party on campus, and also Ignite, which is a young women's political organization on college campuses across the U.S. So with that, we focused on doing voter registration drives, hosting town halls, hosting roundtable talks about just political engagement and getting our students really involved to become active in their communities and around civic engagement, basically. After I served as precinct chair, or during my time of serving during precinct chair, I got involved with some of the other initiatives that we had on campus in addressing some of the problems like an address and zip code problem that we have at the university. And then in 2018, I actually joined a lawsuit with the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, basically challenging the discriminatory acts of voter suppression in Waller County against the officials. And from then on, I would go on to serve with those same colleagues who served as plaintiffs as well, and then also other students and student leaders, organizing marches on campus, sitting and talking with other people who might not be from the county, but might be state officials or running for official positions within the county and within the state. Also advocating on bigger scales that have given me the opportunity to speak with some of the greatest civil rights activists and advocates across the nation. And it's been truly an honor to really serve and to have mentors like Mr. Jackson who have really walked us and guided us through this process, because it has been anything but easy.
But I came to Prairie View in 1969 as a student, as an undergraduate student. And I had the good fortune of being a member of the Naval ROTC. And around the early 70s, one of our midshipmen, Wendell Chin, was elected as student government president. So that kind of got all of us involved in it, because ROTC was mandatory for all male students at that time. But Wendell was one of the ones that brought the first action against Waller County when they tried to register to vote and they were challenged about residency. So that's how we got involved. So needless to say, we supported whatever they did. And when I returned to Prairie View in 1980 as an instructor, we found that the campus was gerrymandered. But thanks to the student leadership, they've always stepped forward. And I just had the good fortune of working with students. It's been the students that's taken the leadership on this and pushed forward. And our role was to run interference to protect them so that they wouldn't get taken advantage of out there. And each time we had a chance to have these leadership, whether it was Jayla or Priscilla Barber, it was the students that wrote the letters to the Secretary of State's office and got the Secretary of State at that time, I think his name was Steen, to come to campus to see what they were talking about. And he went visited with the officials in Waller County, and we had voting back in the student center. And it was only during the time when we were building a new student center that then the community center became that go-to voting point. We wanted that box back in the student center like other campuses, so that the students, that's where they gather, that's where they come together, that's what it was designed for. But from the first student centers in the world, they were designed for students to congregate, share ideas, come up with stuff, and become good citizens. So we wanted that box there. And we've been pushing back and fighting for that ever since. So I cannot say enough about the student leaders. You got to say something. Like the great John Lewis said, if you see something wrong, you got to say something. Even so, sometimes you have to stand out there by yourself. You got to take a stand. And believe me, somebody's going to stand with you. If you're right, somebody will stand there with you. And you have to take those strong winds of change and be an advocate for what you know is the right thing to do. But do your homework. Know that you're right, then go ahead.
I totally agree with what Mr. Jackson just said. Even if you have to stand alone, and luckily, me being a student activist and getting involved, I was never alone, whether I was with other student leaders or those in our community who were helping us, or great mentors and guiders like Mr. Jackson. But what I would say is, and I actually just spoke about this the other day, I was speaking to someone, and I said, you look at like the civil rights movement, you look at all those people like Mr. Jackson just mentioned with John Lewis. These people were 17, 18, 19 years old within their communities, on college campuses. Think about SNCC and all these great these great organizations that came with the civil rights movement. Those were young people who took a stand and said, hey, we see a problem, we want change, and we're going to make sure that change comes today, and if not today, at least tomorrow or next week. And so I think that when you're talking about students getting involved on campus, do it. I mean, we are going to bring the change, and we can't expect those within the community to always do it, or those outside of the campus, or even after you graduate and you do go into certain communities. Make sure that even when no one else is doing the work, that you're doing the work, because that's what matters. That's what's going to bring the change, that we are going to solve the problems in which we are looking at in our communities.
All right, so hopefully you were inspired by that, and you watched the whole video that's in the resources folder later on. I just want to give a few reminders for tomorrow. So we'll be starting again at 11 a.m. We'll learn about some election imperatives from the Institute of Democracy in Higher Education. We'll have a panel about some best practices for digital engagement. I know I had a few conversations with folks today about like, oh, how now that our campus is going to be fully online, like how can we do, you know, the events that we used to do in person digitally? So that panel will be a really great way to learn some of that. We'll have a few more spotlight chats, as well as a breakout session where you can choose to learn about Election Day on campus, voter registration or GOTV work, and also a panel about what is the research about voter engagement and how you can use it to inform your strategy and your work. And then, like I mentioned earlier, if you attend tomorrow, you'll learn about next steps and also funding for how you can get some money to help you with this work. And also, some other resources and programs that we have for you. We'll also be taking a picture tomorrow. So if you could like either wear something that's from your school or like get a background that shows like something about your school, whether it's your mascot or your colors, we're gonna like do a group little screenshot picture situation. So yeah, we're excited to see you tomorrow. And Cassie, do you have any other last thoughts?
If you enjoyed today, our RSVP is still open. So if you have friends who are like, you should really be on this tomorrow, we are totally open to that. It wasn't like a come today and you can't come tomorrow kind of a thing. So please feel free to encourage other folks to join us tomorrow if you think they might be interested as well.
All right, well, we'll see you tomorrow. And if you have any questions, I'll stick around for the next 10 or so minutes. But thanks for joining today, and hopefully you got some good information. Cassie, do you want to stop the recording?